Welcome, everybody. Vitaємо. Good evening, good morning, добрий день, добрий ранок, wherever you are on the globe. We have a lot of folks joining. We'll just wait one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started. So everybody, as you acquaint yourselves to the screen, I just want to make a note, the chat is open, so feel free to post questions, comments there as we move ahead with our presentation today. We've got a really exciting lecture, I would say keynote for us at Fulbright Ukraine for many, many reasons. None more obvious or more exciting than today being September 1st, the new year for many of us as we get back into schools, universities, research, teaching, whatever our endeavors may be. We are all united in also returning back, many of us, to in-person engagements. We are, however, here virtually united, and it's become a tradition at Fulbright Ukraine for us every Thursday, every couple of weeks at 6 p.m. Kyiv time to host talks on topics that are important to our communities at this time in Ukraine, being that we, are all everywhere working to respond to the atrocities that are being committed in Ukraine today in the context of the war. We have with us also not just any speaker, but the former director of Fulbright Ukraine, somebody who understands from the inside what it is that Fulbright stands for and what we are doing here today. So I would like to introduce to you Dr. Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak. And today the topic of her talk is called Smudged Narrative: Why Ukrainians Differ from Russians. A little bit of background about Martha is also on our Facebook page. We are going to record this talk and post it to our YouTube, so you can refer back to the talk and use it in your teaching, your writing, your discussions with your dentist, your neighbors, anyone you want to know about, anyone you want to teach about why Ukrainians are different from Russians. Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak was director of Fulbright Ukraine from 2000 to 2006. She was also a U.S. Fulbright Scholar to Ukraine at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv from 1992 to 1993, and at National University Kyiv-Mohyla, 1997-1998. Her research interests are very wide. They span Ukrainian social intellectual history and women's studies. She's emeritus professor of history at Manhattanville College and has taught at George Washington University, Johns Hopkins University, Seton Hall University, Catholic University of America, Farley Dickinson University, and Harvard University. Also, she was the senior program officer of National Endowment for the Humanities in 1985 to 2000. One of her books that has been foundational also for me as a scholar is Feminists Despite Themselves: Women in Ukrainian Community Life, 1884 to 1939, which was published in Edmonton at University of Alberta Press in 1988. I have also here many more books that I could list, but I would like us to turn the floor to Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak to hear her to speak about us, as a community, to speak about you, to speak about why Ukrainians are different from Russians. So please, Dr. Bohachevsky-Chomiak.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and I really appreciate the invitation and the fact that I can at least virtually reconnect. I hope also reconnect with some of the people that I remember, some of the people who remember me. I must say, although it was difficult working in Ukraine, as it was difficult teaching in Ukraine. I really appreciated the opportunity, and I particularly valued the friendships and the support that I had from everybody. So let me use this opportunity, since opportunities are rare these days, to thank everybody whom I recognize, and increasingly those that I do not recognize. Why the question of what is different between the Ukrainians and the Russians? Well, mainly because when the war broke out, I still had to contend with people coming to me and saying, but there's no difference between Ukraine and Russia. Why should they be fighting? Why would anybody invade Ukraine? It was always very difficult for me to be brief when explaining the differences between Ukraine and Russia, because one always felt obliged to begin with the history, and by the time you reached Middle Ages, the person to whom you were speaking was no longer listening to you. So I also noticed lately that I've been not only slow, but I've been long-winded and no longer as crisp as I used to be. Therefore, I decided today I will not only try to be brief, but I will begin with the conclusions, since I fear that if I keep on droning away, I will never reach the end and never reach the conclusions. So here is my presentation of what I consider to be the real differences between Ukrainians and Russians. I decided on these issues as a result of studying the different historical developments of both countries and the different geographic conditions under which they lived. First of all, Ukrainians have a sense of hope, a realization of individual responsibility and agency that seems not to be quite as evident among other people, among their neighbors. You can call it individualism, but to me it seems more. It is the ability to see the proverbial silver lining. Then Ukrainians are characterized by an openness and by curiosity that leads to acceptance of change and to this particular day, the willingness and the ability to learn. As a result of these characteristics, Ukrainians have had successful experiences with local and community organizations. Chief among them are their churches. And the churches in Ukraine are characterized by some degree of individualism and even some degree of self-affirmation. Ukraine, I think, has had a bit more experience in the conflicts between church and state, a conflict that I think is seminal to the development of the very notion of individualism. Another important characteristic of Ukrainians are their women. Not only the position of women in society, that one can argue with, but Ukrainian women have organized, and that is true of both the Western women who were the first to organize and the Eastern Ukrainian women who organized within the Russian Empire and managed to gain significant achievements within the, albeit small, but nevertheless all imperial women's organization. Ukrainian women have learned to organize and to defend their interests. But primarily, the overriding difference between Ukraine and Russia is the fact that Ukraine has no burden of greatness. Ukraine is not saddled with a sense of having to save the world. Ukraine does not desire greatness, either imperial or sacred or universal. So, if that is the case, why did it take Ukraine until the cusp of the modern society to assert their existence? And of course, one always has to, whether you want to or not, begin with Kyiv. Begin with Kyiv. And I think we've been asking, we historians of Ukraine and Russia actually, have been asking the wrong question. The issue is not whence came Ukraine, откуда пошел, but where did Kyiv go? Куда? Куди пішов Kyiv? We keep forgetting that Kievan Rus did not become Muscovy. Kyiv stayed put and is, thank God, staying put. And when in 1054 Christianity splintered in half, and soon afterwards, the imperial system ceased to exist in Byzantium. What began was not a separation of East and West, but what began in that period was the emergence of Europe, the emergence of the various European communities, which in those days of the 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, hardly had identities similar to the ones we have now. So the trick is to place the study of Eastern Europe, to place the study of Ukraine within a context that is not prearranged, that is not based on whence it comes, but where is it heading? What direction is it taking? I'd like to spend more of my time on Russia than on Ukraine today. First of all, I would like to let Moscow be Moscow. We must remember that Muscovy was founded on a pretty much similar basis as Kyiv was founded. There was a local community, the Varangians came, the Varangians came with their policies of slash and burn and take over, and then leave. But we know some of them stayed in Kyiv. We keep forgetting that the younger Rurikovичи, feeling discriminated against by other people, by members of their clan, moved north and there founded Moscow. So the organizational basis of Moscow is the same as Kyiv, a mixture of Varangians, Norsemen, and the local population. What is different in Moscow is that that particular power principle in Moscow was then infused by the organizational and administrative skill of the Mongols. We must also remember, which we generally forget, that Moscow moved east before it ever moved south, except there was one exception when the Varangian, the young Rurikovичи came and burned Kyiv. So the other difference in Moscow's development is that the traumatized Greek monks, traumatized by the fall of Byzantium, traumatized by the disintegration of their power, they settled in Moscow and carried with them their notions of a messianic universal church. And that notion of universal messianic church stayed in Moscow, more or less. That is a whole different story, but we have to remember that that was one of the founding principles, justifying the attempt of Moscow to become more than just Moscow. The Greeks always defended tradition. And when they came to Moscow, they defended tradition, even though there really wasn't much of a tradition yet to defend. But the idea that power is always linked with tradition, that tradition always justifies power, justifies force, was a deeply imbued one. The Muscovite state, eventually becoming Russia, was based on the centralization of power. With the centralization of power came the centralization of economy and eventually the centralization of culture. That notion of centralization seems to have dominated through all periods of Russian history. Extremely important and generally overlooked is the manner in which ancient Christian church became nationalized in Russia, partly with the help of some Ukrainians, but essentially through the willingness of the church itself. As I mentioned earlier, the fact that the church, which in the West had always been a symbol of organization and power, and therefore a visible enemy within, something that tried to dominate all aspects of the individual. The church provided this other that helped Europeans rediscover the discovery of the Greeks, the discovery of the individual that is strong enough to battle its God, to battle the angels and whatever else one needs to battle. When I look at Russian history through the generations, through the centuries, through the millennia now, what I see is I see a Russia that locked itself in their wooden matryoshkas, failing to see that the doll, the wooden doll, can produce only a smaller wooden doll. It can only reproduce itself. It cannot get out of itself. It becomes smaller and smaller within yourself. And when you study literature and study the really powerful Russian literature, you see the degree of frustration. You reach the point of absurdity. You reach the point of everything is permitted, as Dostoevsky said. For me, one of the most poignant examples of this is an attempt by Andrei Amalrik, who is no longer remembered that much. He was one of the Russian writers with some Ukrainian connection. And he tried his hand at writing a theater of the absurd based on the Gulag community. I use the term Gulag community consciously because that's often in the 60s where the communities were formed. But when Amalrik tried to write his theater of the absurd, he realized that whatever he was able to think up, whatever idiotic absurdity he could think up, he ended up writing about an event that had occurred, that he had either witnessed or that he had heard spoken. With that burden of history, with that unstudied burden of history, one can wonder how a liberal Russia could have ever existed. And as someone who actually did a doctoral dissertation on one of the attempts of the Russians to establish at least an independent university, I can safely say that all of the Russian liberal attempts from Novgorod to Navalny have failed. And just this morning, I was reading the American, well, they're not exactly obituaries, but it seems that every former Moscow correspondent of the New York Times had to write his piece. It's always his piece on Gorbachev and on the failure of Gorbachev's reforms and on the fact that what is happening in Ukraine now is the exact opposite of the dreams and hopes of Gorbachev. Of course, the Ukrainians during the Gorbachev period, as during the Khrushchev period, as during the Cellist period, hoped that it would be possible to work with the Russian community. And indeed, many of us have tried to work with the Russian community. But as many of us have found out bitterly, it is really very difficult for an empire that did not realize that it was an empire to realize that a major part of imperial power rests on the domination on the subject nationalities. And that is the tragedy of Ukraine, in that because of the historical development, Ukraine did become, in more ways than one, but particularly culturally, a colony of Russia. When I say that, my blood turns cold, because a good part of my life was spent arguing with the ultranationalists of all stripes. And when I say today that Ukraine was a colony, I see that Ukraine attempted to free itself from that colonial status with great difficulty. And I am taking a sip of water, which shows that I am actually not lecturing, but speaking from the heart. And I hope that the speaking of the heart doesn't sound as if I were coming with a propagandistic saying from Novgorod to Novotny. Okay. When we come to Ukrainian history, the context, of course, that one has to use is the broad European context, not the narrow context of Eastern Europe. If we look at the development of the Volhynian state, the thinking of the Cossacks, when we study the early modern period, which few of us have studied, and which desperately needed a good foundational study. And I think Zenon Kohut provided part of that. When we look at the history of Ukraine from that point of view, we see that what is usually written off as Ukrainian nationalism or the rise of Ukrainian national consciousness or any type of ideology you want to give it, that it is not different from the developments that Western Europe went through. And from that point of view, what we need in Ukraine is more study of this church-state society triangle, the development of local organizations, even the study of the zemstvos, and particularly the study of women's organizations. Now, from that point of view, it's the women's history, because it was under a double burden. The study of women's history in Ukraine has been progressing despite all of the difficulties of the country, thanks mainly to the efforts of women themselves. Well, of course, one can always argue that now men are involved in other activities than studying history. Nationalism, if you study the nationalist organizations, even the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, if you study their real activities, not limit yourself just to the relatively few violent activities in which they engaged, you see that they are involved also in an attempt to develop the local society. So you find in Ukraine, you find this desire for local development, limited development, local organization, small deeds activity, the drive for education, the drive for social mobility. What characterizes Ukraine is movement towards very often an unidentified goal and unarticulated desire. And the same difficulty that I had when trying to articulate the women's movement, the movement, the organization, the power of the people moves faster than the organizational framework. And people are reduced to becoming feminists, to becoming nationalists when you're stuck to the wall. In the modern times, in Ukraine received a little bit of help from the Ukrainian emigration. But the critical period, of course, was the National Communist period, and then the 1960s and the 1990s. 1960s were important because for the first time, it became possible for at least some of the Ukrainians abroad to be able to visit the Soviet Union. The area which we still have to study deals with the national communists that tried to function abroad, mainly in Canada. And I see myself moving into a tangent where I did not want to move. So let me just end this personal view of Ukrainian and Russian history and the impact it had on the political development, and stress that for my personal understanding of Ukraine, what was really crucial was the opportunity to meet personally with people who knew no other reality but the Soviet reality, to meet with people who were my age, my social economic bracket, who were able to see beyond the confines in which the system in which they were brought up, the USSR, confined them, and see beyond those walls, were able to make the walls bridges. Equally, we in the West showed the same ability to transform the walls into bridges and to dare to hope for a better future for everybody. That was the generation of the 1960s in Ukraine, which was critical in bringing the message of living Ukraine, in bringing the message of genuine Ukraine to the West. Hopefully, the Soviet Union opened up in the 90s, and the rest is no longer history. The rest is present affairs, which you are living, and I, again, am the outside observer, learning as much as I can from whatever sources are available to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha, for your incredible insights and thoughts. And I know we're going to have a lot of questions and comments, so we're going to save our applause. But if there are questions, please put them into the chat, or you can also raise your hand using the icon or just your hands. I guess I will start with one question or comment interwoven throughout your long history. You mentioned at several points the 1960s, and I was also wondering about the 1980s. If you could share with us maybe your observations about dissidents in particular, there being, lots of key figures that went to Canada and the US and became symbols of much larger dissident movement in the 80s as well. I was wondering if you might speak with us a little bit about your observations.
Gladly. Thank you. The 80s, I think, are greatly misunderstood. They were extremely difficult in Ukraine because of the economic shortages, because of the renewed pressure, and because of the increased openness of the industrial society, because of the availability of radio programming, because of the proximity to Poland. And 80s were really critical, more critical in Poland than they were in Ukraine. But in Ukraine, two things happened. On the one hand, the growth of the dissident movement, the popularity abroad of the dissident movement, and what seemed to me the sort of very quick hijacking of the dissidents who managed to make it to the West, and of making them, in the Ukrainian case, of some kind of hero. this is a very complex situation, especially with Valentin Moroz. But with the Ukrainian dissidents, of course, they did yeoman's service to the Ukrainian cause. They were responsible for energizing the young Ukrainian emigre community into getting young people into politics, demonstrations, and that sort of thing. But the web of what was patriotic and what was KGB inspired was so dense that to this, well, I can't say to this day, but what is happening in the United States now is similar to, well, within limits. We haven't started arresting people yet. But you couldn't tell who is really on what side. The 60s, actually, the 60s brought the first attempt within the USSR for the USSR to try to function on the platform that it functioned with the emigre communities, Russian and Ukrainian and Belarusian and Polish, in the 30s, work through students, work through youth. And what it proved was that it was no longer possible to contain even the Russian youth. My first experience with this was attending the youth festival in 1962, I think, in Helsinki, where I asked, it was obvious that the Russians were being treated better than the Ukrainians, when it was impossible to find Ukrainians. And I asked Yevtushenko, are there any Ukrainians? And Yevtushenko, who was then given free rein, unlike any of the other people there, told me that yes, there are 3 Ukrainian writers, and we proceeded to try to locate the 3 Ukrainian writers. The end result of that was that I had some difficulty with not only the local community, the Ukrainian community, but with the FBI as to, am I a communist or am I not a communist? But that was really minor. What was important was that we in the United States started studying Russia as a topic, started studying Eastern Europe as a topic. The Russians, when the empire collapsed in 1917, 1919, 1921, the Russians had a very sizable and a very attractive, active, and moneyed emigration that was able to find a niche in America, in Western Europe, and function. The Ukrainians were never able to do that. But by the 30s, they tried doing it with some success. 50s, 60s, we tried, but it wasn't until really the establishment of the exchange programs at the end of the 1950s, really tail end of the 1950s, 1960s was pretty much limited, really limited exchanges to Moscow. By the 1970s, still very few. 1980s, we started sending scholars to Eastern Europe, more to Eastern Europe, and a small number of us managed to get into Ukraine and even managed to get into some of the archives and use the archives for our purposes. What is interesting is my first experience was actually in Poland, in Przemysl. And when I went to the archives of the church there, at the suggestion of Professor Kyiv, who was not exactly pro-Ukrainian or pro-democratic, but he did suggest that since I was working on women, and he, as all other scholars of his stature, regardless of whether they were Pritsak, Rayev, any one of them, did not consider the subject of women suitable for historical study. So but Kyiv saw through, obviously must have looked through the archives of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in Przemysl, because he suggested that I go to the archives, to the church archives, which were so-called nationalized. And again, first I went there with proper information, with proper cedulki, with everything in as it should be. But by that time, I had been working in Poland, in Warsaw, and I had developed friendship with the Polish Ukrainians, and through the Polish Ukrainians, I was able, since I was working with two kids, I needed a place in Przemysl that was not the local hotel. So the long story is that the local Ukrainian activists decided that they should be the ones that would chaperone me to the archive. I tried to tell them that I will manage with my broken Polish, with my being improperly dressed in jeans, that I will be able to convince the people in the archive on the basis of my gold stamps and everything else that I'll be able to work in the archives. But no, we will take you there. And of course, when they took me there, they were asked to leave, and I was told that I should not be dealing with people of dubious quality. But since it was by that time obvious to the workers that I'm interested in Ukrainian history, and of course, they decided that I would probably not be interested in women, that the women topic is probably just a cover for my real interest in Ukrainian nationalism. So they kept giving me material that I really, at that point, was not genuinely interested. But I'm using this as an example about how convoluted the situation by the end of the Soviet period had become, that when even if I had been a communist, I would still be given materials that should not have been circulated. So for me, the fact that I was able to communicate with people my age, well, first of all, in Poland, then in Ukraine, was really critical in the way in which I was able to present my material to my students. The problem with Ukrainian studies was that it was a niche. And first of all, it was not recognized. I was openly told when I was working on my dissertation to choose a topic not connected with Ukraine. And when I was working on Russian liberalism, that was equally uninteresting to the publishers, to the people who were running the universities, to the students who were taking the course. The popularity of the women's subjects is thanks to the concomitant development of women's interests outside of academia, and then the ability of the American educational establishment to work with outside forces in the introduction of something like women's studies. With the introduction of Ukrainian studies, with the founding of the Harvard Institute, was a process actually paralleled by the women's movement. And it was with the help of the immigrant community, with the help of a generation of Ukrainian, the generation that came of age when the Second World War broke out. And it's that generation that actually sacrificed itself and its careers, and began collecting money that eventually was given to Harvard. And Harvard, the Ukrainian Institute at Harvard, and the same Pritsak who was waiting for Martha to finish her stupid studies of women and move back into history and move into the intelligentsia and move into the political parties, that gave a stamp of approval, legitimized the study of Ukrainian topics. So, but you asked about the 80s. The 80s, Frank.
I have a question from one of our audience members on a related topic to Ukrainian studies before we move on. Olena Fomenko says, "Dear Penny Martha, thank you for this fascinating lecture. What, in your opinion, should Ukraine do to maintain global attention and promote Ukraine studies abroad? To maintain global attention and promote Ukraine studies and study of Ukraine."
What Ukraine is going through now even if Ukraine had not been doing anything, even if Ukraine did not have the really dedicated members of the Ukrainian Foreign Service. And I can't stress enough the tectonic difference that an independent Ukraine with a presence abroad, an official presence abroad, made in the whole development of Russian area studies, Ukrainian studies, Eastern European studies. The fact that in my experience, for instance, a number of people went on a Fulbright even as late as the new millennium, went there not quite convinced as to what a Ukrainian is vis-a-vis a Russian, would come back from the West already speaking, trying to speak Ukrainian. But what Ukrainians are doing, continue doing, I mean, there's not much more that you can do. And your grit and your sense of humor, it really penetrates the Western media. And the media is really covering it. What Ukrainians should do, I hate to, is write more. Write more literature that is written in such a way that the Western audience, with our limited capacity of reading long books, that the Western audience could read, and make certain that the works which you translate are well translated. And there are plenty of translators now who translate very well. But Ukraine is no longer a colony. Ukraine is no longer a second-rate state. Ukraine is no longer a place that no one knows. Ukraine is Ukraine, and Ukraine will continue being Ukraine. I was absolutely, literally depressed and felt that Chernobyl was the end of Ukraine. At that point, I was working with the American National Endowment for the Humanities. And one of Eva Thompson called me and she said, look, a country does not, people do not disappear. This Polish belief in the viability of Poland, I see now in Ukraine. There is no question but the viability of Ukraine. Ukraine is doing all in its power to keep itself alive. We pray, we march, we collect money.
We have another question from one of our alumni from Ukraine, Victoria Rodinkova, who is asking a similar question to the prior one. Where should Ukraine go from here? I guess similar to where does Kyiv go? Откуда versus where to go. What is the modern goal? A question about modernity, I guess, of innovation. And perhaps along with this question, for research in particular, what do you advise for younger generations? You said to write more, but also as a historian, are there time periods or figures or movements that you know about that are totally ignored or that need more attention? I guess in a pragmatic sense, what can younger scholars and students start to recover or focus on in history?
In history and in the humanities, we have to look at contextual issues, look at Ukraine, not solely as Ukraine, not solely as that particular area that is enclosed in itself. And in a sense, Ukraine has already done that. One of the major problems that we all had was the inability to communicate in different languages with Ukrainians. Well, Ukrainians have broken that particular hurdle so that all other sources are open to historians. Historians are also in a difficult situation these days because history is a declining subject of study. And the reason history is a declining subject of study is that we still tend to present history as a series of facts that have to be memorized. And in a sense, I guess, it's easier if you have those facts. On the other hand, given all of the technological advances, my grandchildren are better at getting at the information that I have forgotten from their various electronic devices than I am from my brain. So in terms of what subjects to study is whatever interests you and whatever you consider to be terribly important. I mean, the whole ecological issue has been one of those major problems. Psychology, philosophy. In Ukraine, what I find most frustrating, and those of you who remember me from arguing, is this passive voice in writing. The voice that you use is never your voice, but somebody else's. Говорять, кажуть, припускають. Well, who are these people? Where do you stand in that? The other problem is simply a matter of writing. And writing, I'm in a really awkward position, especially this morning or this evening, as far as Ukraine is concerned, is that I'm telling you, don't write as I speak now, but write crisply and to the point. Say whatever you want to say quickly and to the point. With age, I find myself incapable of doing that. So, but primarily, Ukraine also needs to somehow be able to meld the technical sciences with the humanities and not have that much of a difference between the STEM sciences and the humanities. This is a problem that the entire world has, but I think maybe Ukraine will be in a better position to try to melt that. There were always attempts in Ukraine to do that. Okay.
Thank you. Someone, Sandra Loeb has posted a question about how to get involved or how to help Ukraine in the current situation. I'm going to post a link to resources compiled at Harvard Ukraine Research Institute, the same institute Marta was giving us the history of earlier. This is the standard compiled list and continues to grow. So in addition, if you know of resources where people can donate, please send it to Harvard Ukraine Research Institute so they can add it to this base of resources for Ukrainians and those who want to help. We have a nice comment from Nicholas Roman, who also thanks you for all of your work and for your love for the ancestral homeland, and says every word vibrates from your heart. I've seen many similar comments coming up in our chat from all different people. So Martha, at some point, if you do have a chance to revisit this recording, or we will send you a copy of the chat so you have all of those greetings. It's quite exciting to see. And I want to give everyone a last moment here to ask a question. We have about 10 minutes left. Does anyone have any final burning questions they would like to pose? All right, Martha, do you have any last regrets, or do you have any cliffhangers about upcoming publications we can look forward to, recent books or a potential memoir?
My potential memoir, I don't know when potential memoir comes. Right now I'm writing an article that Marta Juba asked me to write about what I remember of Ivan Juba. I have been trying to see if I'll be able to write my memoirs, but I always get waylaid or just too lazy to do that. What I have done is I've written a new book that has been translated into Ukrainian, and the book is it seems to be a biography of my uncle, the first metropolitan of the Ukrainian Catholic Church in the United States. But actually, it's a book on the relationship between the church and the community, both in Halychina in the interwar period and in the pre-war period, First World War period, and all through the 1950s. The Ukrainian version is slightly fuller and more precise on a number of issues than the English version. The English version, the title is Ukrainian Bishop American Church. My grandchild refers to it as UBEC. The Ukrainian title is Hromada Episkop Cerkva v Americi, and that translates into Hetza. If anybody from Halychina still remembers the term Hetza, Hetza is a prank, a little joke. a well-meaning joke you play on your sister or your younger brother or somebody like that. So it's a book that I hope is going to perform a similar function that the feminists, despite themselves, I think, performed, of just stimulating interest and the importance of genuine social studies, of genuine psychological studies, and really a plea to those many, many, particularly women writers, of writing books that could readily be understood and accepted by Western readers. The Nigerians have done that with the Nigerian community. The Muslims are trying to do that with the American market is difficult to penetrate, but it is worth penetrating because America today needs Ukraine. America today, President Biden will be speaking on the soul of America. Well, these are the topics that since the mid-19th century, philosophers of Northern New York State, we in the United States have not really been paying attention to. My generation, in American schools, we were still taught romantic poetry. My children no longer studied that. So Ukraine has that rich trove of common song, common poetry, common song for the most part. But then remember that there are also tone deaf people like me who do not sing. So we read, give us something to read. In general, I must stress that the Ukrainian establishment and the Ukrainian government, and especially the Ukrainian representation abroad, have been doing a yeoman's service, have been working almost nonstop, doing everything in their power to support Ukraine in this difficult period. But this is not the first difficult period that Ukraine has known. This is not the first crisis through which Ukraine has been living. This is an existential crisis for the rest of us. And Ukraine's picture is, let me end on a memory from 1980, from my first visit to Ukraine. And I had an interview, a series of interviews, but one interview with, I think her name was Maria Mazur, definitely Mazur, but I can't say. She was the editor of Radянська жінка. And as we were talking, this is 1980, she says that she was always surprised that her fellows, Ukrainians, would use a village house, a village building, a village hut, as an example of Ukrainska chata. For her, Ukrainska chata were the suburbs of Kyiv and Chernihiv. And that really struck me as a deep understanding of one's roots. And I was so proud of this Soviet journalist of a women's journal that 10 years later became Zhinka, harking back to a newspaper, a journal that was published in interwar Halichina. So that is why I'm still living. That's why I'm still trying to do the little I can. And that's why I really appreciated that all of you joined me in this, I presume, rambling presentation.
This is great. I wanted to also mention that this journal, Zhinka, is held, copies of it, digital copies are held now at University of Toronto, and University of Alberta acquired also recently this collection, this digital collection, only in 2019, I believe, very recently. So anyone who wants to do research on that journal can get into the library databases in those two universities. It's there. Thank you. This has been an incredible hour and a half that we have all shared together. And before we applaud Martha, I want to also mention that next week, same time, we will have another amazing presentation featuring 4 researchers, scholars from our Fulbright community in Ukraine and in the US. The topic will be how art today, Ukrainian art, shapes decolonialism. So very connected to the lecture today by Martha, decolonialism. And we will continue to have virtual presentations and discussions throughout the year. We welcome all of your ideas. Write to us if you would like to propose a topic or help form a panel. We're delighted to be a part of this ongoing conversation. And we thank especially Dr. Martha Bohachevsky-Chomiak for her knowledge, her wisdom, her leadership, blazing trails for all of us in the younger generations, and especially for opening up a new area of knowledge, a new inspiring year beginning September 1st, 2022. So thank you, Dr. Bohachevsky-Chomiak. We give you a round of applause.